So at this time, I'd like to introduce our first panel, which is delving into the ideal of service and also looking at service and gratitude. It's moderated by our thought partner, Eric Liu from Citizen University, but we also welcome chef, author, food activist, and founder of Chez Panisse Restaurant and the Edible Schoolyard Project, Alice Waters. Artist, curator, urbanist, and facilitator, Theaster Gates. Visual artist and storyteller, Carrie Weems. And writer, editor, and publisher, Dave Eggers. We welcome them to the stage.
It is wonderful to be here this morning, and Mario, thank you for that introduction. Deborah, Renee, Yo-Yo, David, thank you for setting the scene, and we are riding the wave already. This is just a great, great feeling. My name is Eric Liu. I am the co-founder, and CEO of Citizen University, and all of our work at Citizen University is focused on trying to democratize understanding of power in civic life. And there's a dimension of that, of course, is about the mechanics of how decision-making happens in the public sphere and how policy gets made. But as we've already been hearing this morning, there's a core dimension of understanding power in civic life that has to do with art and creativity. It has to do with the ways in which we imagine ourselves to be a community and the power that derives from the stories that we tell and the ways that we weave together a greater sense of us in this society, in this culture. And that is going to be the spirit of so much of this day. But this panel in particular that we're going to begin with today is on the theme, as Mario said, of service. And I just wanted to say a few words at the outset before we dive into this conversation about service. Some of you may have seen in the New York Times yesterday, actually, in the Sunday Review section, a rather moving and beautiful essay by one of my heroes, Harris Wofford, former United States Senator from Pennsylvania, former head of the Corporation for National Service, who wrote an essay that was, on one level, about how at age 90, he had found new love in his life after 20 years of being widowed, and he'd found new love in ways wholly unexpected to him. And you can read the piece. I won't give away the rest of that. But there was a phrase that he used in this piece that moved me so much. Because he had been, as a younger man, incredibly active and vital in the civil rights movement at the side of, as one of his books is called, of Kennedys and Kings. And he described that time as akin to this time, which was, he said, a, quote, creative hour. We live in a creative hour. We are called in a creative hour, where new terms of relating to one another are being rewritten, where new notions of who is us and new notions of who gets to claim voice and power in American life are coming to the fore. And this creative hour is one where the spirit of service becomes absolutely necessary. Because as we see in so much of our politics right now, a creative hour can also yield the birth of a lot of ugliness. It can yield the birth of a lot of solipsism and just self orientation. When all bets are off and all the old givens are no longer given. But a creative hour can and should also be about a spirit of, it's not about you. It's about us. It's about something bigger. And all four of our panelists today, in their work, in their art, in their ways of being, are incredible instantiations of this spirit of service. And you've heard their biographies, and as we talk in this conversation, we're going to hear a bit more about some of the texture of the work that each of them is doing. But I wanted to begin this conversation with a common question that I'm going to pose to all four, and ask them to speak to this question for a couple, 3 minutes. And then we're just going to go into a more free-flowing, open conversation for the balance of this hour. And the common initial question, and I may start with you, Theaster, is simply this. How, in your work, was a spirit of service initially manifested? What was the spark for you as an artist that said, I'm not only an artist, I'm an artist in service to others?
So, I mean, this is a complicated question because sometimes when you're working, you're not always mindful of when the work is for you and when it's for others, if the work is good. And I think, there's one way of talking about it that is about family, that we were a big family, and so we didn't have the luxury of being selfish. We didn't have the opportunity to understand selfishness because we were too broke and our family too loving. And I remember for Christmas, I'm from the age of Atari. I had an Atari 2600 and an Atari 5200. And I remember for this Christmas, I was about 13 and I had gotten an Atari 5200. I was very excited. My nieces wanted to play Atari with me. I didn't want to share my Atari. My mom made me give both Ataris to my nieces. Right? It was like this moment where there was an immediate reprimand for the instinct of selfishness. And I thought at the time with my 5200 that was an act of survival, that the Atari was mine. They were going to mess up my joysticks, and it was mine. And to have something precious taken from you and just redistributed was hurtful. My nieces actually didn't play the Atari 5200. They just took it downstairs, and everybody was in on, like, they were teaching me a lesson. So I apologized and that, and then we all played Atari. They broke my joysticks. But I think I learned something in that time about the value of giving things up, right? And over time, it felt like over and over, I learned that I received so much more pleasure, so much more in real return when I was generous. And I think that, the second experience I talk about was when my art career first started to take off. I just didn't understand how these opportunities were happening. It didn't make sense. And so the thing that made sense was that I would immediately just kind of, if I was having a big dinner with a curator, that I'd invite other artists. If somebody was coming to visit the house, that would turn into a dinner, and people who would never have access to that person would have access. Then when new kinds of resources came, I was reminded of the Atari 5200 story, that if I were to take this moment to be selfish, not only would it be an act against me, but it would be an act against the people who are important in my life. And so I think that my mom just beat my ass. She just beat the selfishness out of me. And that today, I really feel like the part that I feel so great about is being able to create platforms where other artists can have some of the opportunities that I always wanted to have, and that I think I've just kind of tried to build a life where if there's a thing that I knew was missing, my citizenship would try to fill in the gap.
One of the things that is beautiful about that story, from now on, social scientists talk about strong reciprocity, right? You do right by me, I'll do right by you. You do wrong by me, I will do wrong by you twice as hard, right? But forget that social science stuff. You just call it the Atari 5200 lesson, right? And Alice, I mean, part of what Theaster is talking about is this spirit of mutuality and reciprocity, right? And so obviously that is so manifest in the work that you do in things like the Edible Schoolyard. But again, I want to return to this initial question of how, initially, what the seeds were for you of the spirit of service, and it's not just about you in your work as a culinary artist.
Well, I'm right in the middle of writing a memoir, and I've had to look back on the first part of my life because I'm not writing it from the beginning of the restaurant. I wanted to really talk about how I came to open that restaurant at that particular time. And I went back to my parents' Victory Garden that they had made during World War II. And I'd like to think that their swapping of vegetables might have been some of the beginnings of that. And I also found out that my mother was a real radical I mean, she was the only one who voted for Adlai Stevenson at that time, and she made me wear a little button to school, and I was very self-conscious, and like Theaster was saying, you know, we didn't have much money, and so we had to wear the clothes I had to wear the clothes of my older sister, and they'd be all winter clothes to be put up in the attic, and we go up there. That was the store upstairs, and we choose what we want. The only thing we got were new shoes, because my mother really felt like, you know, you need healthy feet, really healthy feet. But probably it all happened in the free speech movement. And it was a time, an incredible time, where I would ride my bike down to the freeway, just put it on the side, then hitchhike to San Francisco. Somebody would always pick me up, came back, my bike was there. I just got on my bike and went back home. And it was everybody shared whatever they had. And like you were saying, I'm feeling that again, that you know, I just want to open the doors to my house, and a young person who's coming and who wants to visit the edible schoolyard or whatever can stay and come to eat at Chez Panelist. And so, come on.
And their bike will still be there at the end.
But probably the most important moment of collaboration was during the AIDS crisis. And we did several benefits, and we worked with artists in all fields. And we did an event for 9,000 people at the Greek Theater. And I thought that I was sort of in charge in some way of things, but I realized that it was so far beyond that. It was, everyone had someone that they cared about. And it was something that was greater than the sum of the parts. And from that point on, I've wanted to collaborate with everyone, with artists, with cooks, with everybody, because I know we can lift it up. I know we can.
Beautiful. Thank you. Carrie May. Actually, what was your family call you, Carrie or Carrie May?
It depends.
So how family am I to you right now? What can I call you?
My family calls me Dee Dee.
Dee Dee. Okay. All right. I won't claim that yet. But Carrie May, you know, your work, and those of you who haven't yet seen or experienced the work, is so viscerally powerful in so many ways, in part because it dislocates memory. And it places us in and out of time in different ways. And we'll talk more about that work. But again, as you even hear these first two answers to the kind of origin story question, as an artist who is playing with time and memory and senses of identity, where was your sense of service placed,
Yes,
and
yes,
where do you find
yes,
its
yes.
origins?
Well, you know, first of all, I have to say that being on this panel with these extraordinary people is such a pleasure for me. You know, I was so weird. I was so strange as a child. Do you know what I mean? I was an existentialist by the time I was like 8. So I've always been very strange, and curious, and asking lots of questions that I had no answers to. And of course, I still ask lots of questions that I have no answers to. And the older I get, you know, like I just had my birthday, I'm starting to set back my age, like by a decade. But you know, I have more and more questions that I just don't have the answers to. But I think that I feel so incredibly, extraordinarily blessed because my family, my mother, who I actually didn't think a lot about until I was older. I always thought it was my father who was my great gift, but it was my mother and her sisters who showed and continue to show me the depth and the beauty and the generosity and the grace of service in the way in which they have served their children and their families. I am notoriously unlike my mother, so I'm like deeply selfish. And you know, like on the one hand, I think of serving and giving the fullness of myself, and at the same time, I'm deeply interested in the expanse and the possibilities that are really rooted in my own life. And so there's something about holding on to this life, but also offering my creative impulses to a wider community. So I'm interested in the tension that resides in both those spaces of being deeply interested in my own creative imagining and what comes out of this body, and yet being also very interested in how it can be a guide and a focus and used in for the benefit of service, for the benefit of something greater than I.
It's really very powerful. And Dave, we were talking before we came on stage just about just the rhythm of your recent life and how relatively little of your bandwidth you have to spend in managing the network of learning centers called 826 National and now Scholar Match, which we'll talk about, another civic venture that you've launched, and how much of your time you still get to spend, as you say, in your garage, writing, doing that kind of deep both introspection and drawing on self. As you do that, again, for you, as an artist whose work in writing is often so intensely solitary, how did those seeds of larger context and service get planted for you?
Well, I'll echo what Carrie May said. To create, I was a failed art student. We were talking about that, and I now back in my garage. Now I'm painting again a little bit, ridiculous paintings that I shouldn't be doing at my age. But anyway, but I writing is incredibly lonely, and I have to sort of sit in the writing position at least for 8 hours a day to get maybe 45 minutes of work done. And so I would sit, I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and just sitting there and trying to get my first book written and feeling very disconnected. And this was the first time I was about 29. It's the first time I'd never had a full-time job. I always had multiple jobs and temping until I was 28 and just running around. And so there I was just sitting and feeling, when you're there alone 8 hours a day, you can go around the bend, I think, a little bit, and feeling very disconnected. And also what you're working toward, you don't know if it'll come to anything. I'd never written a book, and I had no expectation that it would come to anything. And but I'd been, this is the most solitude I'd ever had. And so I used to walk around Brooklyn during the day because I worked at night, and I would sort of walk around, and right near my house my apartment was PS 51, which is this great public school in Brooklyn, and near 5th and 5th. And I would walk in. My mom was a teacher. She was a volunteer in the schools when I was a kid, and then she became a full-time teacher. And I was used to always seeing my mom at school. Everybody knew my mom, and I was used to this porous boundary between my family and the school. And always seeing her there, and she was tireless. And so I used to walk by PS 51 and think two things like, one, I wonder if there's some way I could be useful to feel connected in some way and not, so sort of isolated and solitary during the day. I wonder if there was some way I could volunteer the way my mom did and be, feel like I'm a human being, I guess, and not some disconnected, I don't know. So, but there wasn't that conduit at the time. There wasn't a volunteer program at PS 51. So that sort of got into my head as like a way and in Brooklyn, even back then, there were a lot of writers. Now you can't swing a cat without hitting one. They're everywhere. So there's all these people that you wouldn't do that though. You wouldn't swing a cat. But if you were going to, that's a vivid image I didn't see coming out of my mouth. Didn't plan it, it's not in my notes. But you do feel like there's so many freelancers, so many editors, so many people who have flexible hours, and I wanted to sort of think about how to connect all of these people with time to give with the teachers and the schools and the families that might, find a few hours of their time useful here and there. So that's how it started, was a way to sort of connect these two communities, the teaching community that I knew, so many of my good friends are teachers, and then with all of these sort of artists that had some flexible time, and sort of connect them and make maybe both communities could get something out of it. And I feel like our volunteers, who aren't just writers now, get just as much out of it as the students and the teachers and the schools and the families, because we do yearn for that connection and yearn for that daily utility. And there's nowhere on earth that you feel more useful than 2 hours shoulder to shoulder with a young person that might benefit from having a light shine on them for a few hours and tell me more about your work, tell me what you're working on, let's make it better, let's, and so I think I'm babbling now. You have to stop me whenever I just start trailing off.
I'll do the dead cat swinging.
There you go, hit me with it. I didn't say dead cat, but see.
The imagination is a terrible
there you
thing.
go. There you go, Eric. Now we learned something about Eric Liu. But, I've been following Eric since we were both in our 20s, and a magazine I used to work for wrote a profile about him as a man on the move when you were like 23. So because you asked us this question, you have to answer it too, because you're not just the moderator. You're the guy that's written books about this, so you have to sort of answer the same question. Come on.
Not okay. Boy, I was not. I think one of the things, so much of my life is shaped by being second generation, by being the child of immigrants. Yes, on one level, my mother made a real point. I grew up outside of Poughkeepsie, New York, so a train ride away from Manhattan. And my mother made a real point when I started showing even the slightest bit of interest in anything artistic, in drawing or initially taking violin lessons, and get me down to New York and hearing concerts, going to the Metropolitan Museum and seeing the Degas, seeing the Matisse, what have you. And so there's one layer of that where kind of the exposure early on to creativity and to a sense that there was this broader community around me mattered. But actually, when I stop and think about it, it reflects one of the running themes just in all four of your answers here. One of the running themes in all four of the answers to this initial question is variations on family, right? Where does the spirit of service emerge? It emerges out of family, or out of what we construct to be family, right? For us, and the porousness of the borders, as Dave says, between family and not family. And when you grow up in an immigrant household, you grow up in a household, at least I did, where there's just a very strong unspoken sense in everything we did that, number one, everything's getting made for the first time, right? Every case is a case of first impression in how you navigate American life and how the patterns you set and the ways that you relate to neighbors and do things. And number two, every single opportunity you have comes with an equal or greater obligation. Because all I did was just get born. I just had the dumb luck to be born in the United States, right? And my parents had to work to come here, and people in their friend set had to really think about the choices and the trade-offs and the sacrifices that were necessary. And so I think that was just ambient in the same way that, Theaster's mom, whooping him metaphorically with the Atari was ambient. That wasn't about your art making per se, but I think that shaped a lot of my sensibility from an early age on. And I think, as it is with all of you, actually, it takes sometimes a while for those seeds then to sprout, right, in the forms that we now recognize them. But I think that work in the answers that you all gave, laying this foundation of family and context is crucial. So
It seems
thank you
like
for,
this may be the first kind of crux then to me, because I think that one of the challenges, at least that I experience in the United States, is that the way that we perceive who our family is, or who the insider benefactors or beneficiaries are of our whatever we have to offer of our service, that seems like the family circle is getting smaller and smaller. That in a way, whatever was considered extended family for my family was huge. I mean, like, we had to feed the entire, it felt like a square mile, and I had to deliver food on Sunday mornings to the sick and shut-in. That was my mom's thing. She would make enough. And so cooking was never about the 9 of us, right? We were already at 9 plus some kids around. It was never about that nucleus family. It was like the 35 of us or the 40 of us, or just make enough so that during the week, if somebody, don't have what they need, right? And so in a way, that was a kind of social welfare. It provided, it made for a kind of social provision that didn't need a welfare state in that sense. That there were ways in which my mom understood that the block just had needs, and if collard greens were 69 cents a pound, we would just get more collard greens.
And so, but the thing that's really interesting about this is that it's sort of through this these early interventions that you start to really learn something about sharing the platform, about sharing the platform and about sharing the gift, right? So that some of us, first of all, our artists are really, we're really not polite, right? And art isn't polite, and the best of it, as Simon Schuma says, takes you by the head and roughs you up and turns your world around and forces you to begin to think about life and your role in it differently, right? And so that's what artists are. We are rebels, with perhaps a cause, And so, this idea about collaboration, about learning to share the platform, about using the platform critically and expressively, about using these ideas about citizen artist critically and obsessively and excessively, I think is also really, really clear and key. Knowing that we are part of a longer tradition, a tradition that, again, goes sort of outside of you, but it's also a part of the tradition of citizen artists, I think is also really important. And then thinking about, for me, thinking about the way in which we define that. So in some of the work that, that I'm really interested in, Yale called me about doing a book, and I said, oh, that would be great. I want to do a case study. I want to do a case study with a whole bunch of artists who are doing, I think, really significant things in the sort of intersection between art and civic dialogue, right? Art and social engagement. So, so I immediately start thinking about earlier people like Anna Devere Smith, who did that extraordinary project long ago at Harvard, maybe 15, 20 years ago, right? I mean, there are a number of artists who have been working in this way, and that a part, I think, of the way in which I think of service is in understanding that critical history, and providing a context for that critical history. And right now, again, working on this series of books. Theaster is one of the artists who's involved in this case study. Rick Lowe, Mark Bradford, Amalia Mesa Baines, Suzanne Lacey, with Jeff Chang at Stanford and the Diversity Institute doing the sort of overview of what has been going on within the field of art and civic engagement, or art and citizenry?
One of the things that, Carrie May, as you're describing this sense of sharing the platform, Theaster was talking about it, 1 square mile in terms of place, in terms of physical place. You're extending that notion of place in time again and thinking about where we, what our origins are. And Alice, I know, your work fuses both those dimensions.
Well, I just feel like we are in a very serious place because I believe what the great French philosopher said back in a couple hundred years ago, Briat-Savarin, that the destiny of nations depends on how we nourish ourselves, and that we are what we eat. And so we're in this place where what we eat is fast food. And we don't just become sick from the food that we're eating, but when we're eating it, we're digesting the values of fast food. So we like everything fast, cheap, and easy. And we don't like diversity. We like it all the same, whether we want the same T-shirt in Bogota as we have in San Francisco. Advertising confers value, that more is better. That the idea of going out into nature, you have to buy all this equipment now to go out there. It's dangerous. Cooking is drudgery. Doesn't matter what season it is. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Who are those people that are cooking? And so I really feel like this is the world we live in. 85% of the kids in this country don't eat one meal with their family. Now, we probably all grew up eating a meal with your family and talking about something that was important to you. So we're in a very dangerous place where our culture has been imprisoned by this lack of beauty, the lack of an education with the senses. And so I think we have to really focus on the public schools. It's kind of our last place. It's, as Gloria Steinem says, it's our last democratic institution. And go back there and bring it back, resuscitate it, and do an intervention there that is so profound that children wake up to that.
Will you say a word for those who don't know about the Edible Schoolyard, just about how it works and what it does?
Well, very quickly, it's a project that I started in a middle school in Berkeley, 1,000 kids. It just happened by chance because the principal called me up and said, maybe you could come and see whether you could beautify our schools. I think you have something to do with gardens. And so I went there. And we walked around the school, and it was built in 1921 on 17 acres of land for 500 kids. And now they have 1,000 kids that speak 22 different languages. And so I went there, and I had been a trained Montessori teacher. And so, way back when, teaching 3 to 6-year-olds. And I started looking around the campus, and I said, Neil, I just don't want to do just a garden here. I see a cafeteria, I see a garden and a kitchen as laboratories for teaching every academic subject. So it's not a garden per se, but when the kids are out there doing their math class, they like it. And again, I'm trying to win them over. I'm not trying to tell them any. It's a Montessori principle, and I suppose it's a slow food movement principle that you want to just win them over by taste and pleasure, and that's what's happened over the years. That we're about 6 weeks to kale, and And it's very...
What time is it? 6 weeks to Kale. That's good.
6 weeks to Kale. 6 weeks to Kale. But it's because they are empowered. They're empowered to do this, and they work collectively, and it's so beautiful to see you. And everybody who comes into this project just thinks it's right as rain. And the kids, in the process of learning a language class, they learn to cook. So the big part of this vision that we have not yet accomplished is that we wanted a free school lunch for every child. Well, we wanted for every child in America. But I thought the way to get the time and the focus would be to make school lunch an academic subject. Okay? And then, so let's say it's a language class and you're speaking Spanish. So you're eating a tortilla soup. You know, you're having that class, you're sitting at a table.
Wonderful.
You're having a conversation, the conversation that these kids don't have at home anymore. And, you know, we had to make conversation cards, asking questions, so that kids could feel free enough to speak at the table. I mean, they didn't know what to say. I mean, truly, they had never set a table.
Wow.
And so it's something, I think the really deeply hopeful part about this is that it's inside all of us since the beginning of time. The ideas of eating together, of eating locally, of eating seasonally, of celebrating harvests, of helping young kids to learn, of, you know, all of that is inside. And when you touch it, it just comes on back.
There's a phrase that Alice just used in describing when you initially came to that schoolyard. I see a cafeteria, I see this broader thing, right? And so obviously that is a literal expression of imagination, of civic imagination. And Theaster, I'm wondering for you, in the work you've done with Rebuild Foundation and all the dimensions of the projects in which you have reimagined parts of a city, right, in Chicago, and repurposed is too kind of utilitarian a word. You've kind of opened, in the same way that Alice is talking about turning school lunch into an academic subject, you've just turned old spaces and old buildings into some of the greatest theaters and laboratories of art and citizen artistry that you can find. Was that a matter of, at the outset, you came to this place and you said, I see, this could do this, or was it more accidental and organic than that?
No, this is good. So let's say the I see part is where we start, that artists can see things. But when you're looking at a building that costs $10 million to restore, your ability to see is only part of the solution, right? And so I think this is where Yo-Yo's early statement about empathy and criticality, that the I see part could then lead to somebody else seeing, and that requires a little bit of humility and kind of sharing, right? And then it has to turn into something else, right? And so let's say that the spaces let's put the spaces and what they became aside for a minute. What I was actually after was convincing the city at large that this black neighborhood that had been underinvested for a long time was worth investing in. Let's say that was and that investment would include everything, medical centers, schools, whatever, and I'll contribute what I could. First, I had to get the city to believe that the investments that they might make in the future could have a return. So I would say, if you invest in these kids, great things might happen. That wasn't enough. I created a business plan. Business plan says, if I renovate these spaces, I can get people to move here. And people would say, well, who in the hell is going to live here? right? And there was no way, it was like what I've learned through ceramics is that when you make a fire in the kiln, there's a period of time where the chamber has to warm up, and then once the chamber warms up and there's a chimney, then there's a draw. And there's a kind of a movement that takes the fire from wherever it is and it pulls it through the kiln. And this action of creating the draw is super important, right? So I understood that like making a fire is one part of it. And then there's this other work that kind of like the fire has to continue, right? So rather than having a conversation about sustainability, what I realized was that in neighborhoods that are deeply struggling economically and with violence and that, people have given up hope so much, right? So part of the seeing also required that you start doing something. That there needed to be a demonstration, and that the demonstration needed to be like, even in a symbolic way, bigger than anybody, like anything anybody had ever seen. So I knew that the stakes were high, but these are things that artists that we grapple with in exhibition spaces all the time. That we're trying to help other people stay longer and look longer at the thing that we're trying to say. And so if I could get people to sit, stand, look longer at Black space, that looking might also create new kinds of compassion, and that there would be then this draw. So that then as we add more fuel, that fuel would get distributed in bigger and bigger ways throughout, say, the neighborhood of the kiln or whatever. And so I think that for me, trying to first say, I see, then would you be willing to see with me? Oh, we see, right? And then and that's the empathic part. And then it's like, in order to do this. Yep. and so the difference then, and this is where the citizenship part becomes so interesting. And lately, I've been just thinking about Rosenwald and Carnegie and these kind of guys, or John Johnson. Like these moments where past vision, you then have to know how to do some stuff.
Yes.
And so the knowing how to do stuff is what separates, say, so I can poetically talk about the challenges of Detroit or Chicago or Indiana in a museum. But if I wanted to actually get out of my studio and out of the museum and into real space, it requires another set of skills.
That's right.
And the world doesn't always prepare great seers to be ready to do work in the world beyond the symbolic. And so it meant having to learn a new set of skills that could convert seeing into a kind of action. And I think that's where a new citizenship was born for me.
You have given the very definition of citizenship there. Dave, that conversion from seeing to action, and that sense that new skills might be needed. Is this feeling familiar to you as you began to, you took that vision for 826?
Everything Theaster just said, it was how so I left Brooklyn, moved back to San Francisco where I'd lived a long time, and we had this idea for a neighborhood center where we would combine the writing community and the schools. And we found a space in the Mission District of San Francisco where there's a lot of public schools within walking distance. We found the perfect spot. It used to be a weight room. And I used to know it as a weight room, rubber floors just like this. And, but I had no experience running a nonprofit, didn't know the paperwork, had no experience signing a lease in a business district, no experience with anything, no experience renovating a building that was 100 years old and needed a lot of work. But a high school friend and I, we just signed a lease one day in September 2001. And we just signed a lease. We had no clue what we were doing. We papered up the windows and we got going. We had a budget of $25,000, which was like breaking the bank. And we did the tear down ourselves and, stripped the floors ourselves, painted the walls ourselves. And still, we had no idea what we were doing. When we finished the building, we'd spent like $27,000, which was like mind-boggling to have spent. And then we still didn't know. But this building was zoned for retail. Some of you guys might know the story. And we thought, okay, well, it's going to be a writing and tutoring center and a publishing house in the back. But the landlord said, no, you got to sell something. Has to be open to the street. You have to sell something in the front of the store. And so we had no idea what to sell. But when we had done the work on the building, it looked like it was old wooden floors and beams, and it looked like the hull of a ship. So someone said, ha, you should sell pirate supplies. And so, so people had suggested a bookstore, a cafe, but we said, no, we're going to, stick it to this zoning obligation, and we're going to sell supplies to the working buccaneer. And so we actually did that, and, eye patches and peg legs and hooks and hook protectors for nighttime and all that stuff. And what happened was, we had no idea what we were doing. We didn't have a business license to sell pirate supplies. We had to get one of those. That's an interesting application to make to the city. And
the Department of Piracy is.
There's a subset of the regular Commerce Division. Yeah, but what happened was the pirate supply did fantastically well, like week one, and it paid the rent on the whole building. And then right behind it, the kids were learning, and we had drop-in tutoring, and then classes, and evenings, and work, and weekends. But what it taught us, though, was that the shape of the solution is never going to be within the your original conception. And so we had to stay flexible. We also stay flexible, knowing we don't know how best we can serve this neighborhood. So we're going to let the parents, we're going to let the teachers, we're going to let everyone in the community come in and tell us, no, actually, you got to do a little bit more of this. And you've got a couple hundred tutors. Well, we could really use you to come into schools. We could use more field trips during the day. We could use this. And we knew what we didn't know. We didn't know how to sell pirate supplies, but we learned. We got our wholesalers. There's a lot of pirate wholesalers. It's true. I know them all. And we knew, what's that?
Sustainable?
And sustainable. It was predictable,
Yes.
predictable income. So we paid our rent on our own. We still, we got we had to ask for money and grants and all that stuff. But we knew we could cover our rent by selling planks and, parrot food and things like that, and puffy shirts and stuff. But the last thing that happened, though, was that because we wanted it to be a creative space and kids to feel welcome, and we knew it was going to be for kids, most of whom are English language learners, we didn't want them to feel stigmatized. It can't be the center for kids that are falling behind, the kids that aren't at grade level. We just called it 826 Valencia, which was the address, and then they walked through a pirate store to get to their tutors, and there's no stigma. It's like, I'm going to the pirate shop, And so because of the zoning obligation, because somebody had this stupid idea about pirate supplies, it sort of felt much more inclusive. The kids are excited to go. They run down the street after school to come into the pirate supply. And if they're learning differently and they feel maybe not always 100% included in they're not up to grade level, they're struggling, maybe they're new arrivals, they're learning English. They know that the people working and tutoring at the pirate supply store are also maybe thinking a little differently and maybe learning a little differently. They can trust those weirdos because kids are the weirdest people alive. And so we decided we needed to reflect that too and stay weird. And so this is one of our slogans, is always keep it weird. So all of the other centers that we open around the country, they all have storefronts. They sell superhero supplies in Roxbury, Boston. It's a Bigfoot Research Institute.
Seattle
which
was space for a while, right?
Yeah, and it's a space travel supply company in Seattle. So, I don't know what I'm saying, but, it's like you got to make it up as you go along. You got to stay flexible.
Though, because
the thing that I'm really impressed with is that all of us work very seriously and very deeply across a number of different platforms, but the thing that is common amongst all of us is all of us are engaged very deeply in community practice and community work and working with children. So Theaster's project, if you haven't seen it, you should. Dorchester project is extraordinary. Alice's project is meaningful and deep. This project that David has been working on, the way he's been working on it, which I've been following for a long time, I think is amazing. I work with kids through my Institute of Sound and Style, introducing kids to vocational training in the arts, photography, video, and so forth. I think that we should actually do a project together.
yes.
I think we should do a project together. I think that You know, this idea, you know, really, ultimately, we're creative innovators. We're creative innovators. And we use, I think, the skill that we bring to our practice, the sort of brilliance that, you know, and the sort of focus and determination that we bring to the creative process of responding to the deep human impulse is the thing that ultimately is the catalyst for the way we ultimately wind up working generally, I think, within the expanse of our lives.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not working on a project, I'm living.
Yeah.
I'm living my life, and I'm trying to figure out how to live it with deep integrity, with deep humility, with compassion, with aspects of grace.
So
right?
Carrie Mae, so I want to just deal with Carrie Mae for a minute, because I think the fact that Carrie Mae heard us, there was an assessment, kind of examples of our capacity. Carrie Mae examines our capacity and immediately starts a corporation, right? And I hear that, you know, these books like the 7 Effective blah blah blahs of great leaders, whatever, is that they don't wait. They don't wait. They're not waiting for it to be right or whatever. It's like, if something hits and it sounds right, it's like, you know what are we waiting on? We could.
Yeah.
That's right.
Right? And I think that then there's the question, and I'm thinking about this in relationship to these new fellows that have been selected, who look like an amazing cohort, and I hope you guys know each other and grow with each other in your practices, is that there has to be a way that citizenship is connected to leadership, right? That there's the ability, like, so badly today, and I think David hit it hard, we need leadership so badly. And the fact that, like, you know, we just going about our thing, right? But there's such an absence of real leadership in the citizenry that, like, we don't birth those people as much. And the people who would be leaders are probably all hedge fund managers, great big accountants. Like, the world has shifted so much in terms of where the intellectual life and social fittings, so the badass social thinkers are at Google creating networks.
That's right.
And I think that unless we find a way to add other kinds of value besides monetizable monetary value, the great leadership that could be probable in the world, we won't have access to them because the market will do so much better a job at rewarding them.
But there's a way to do that that goes to what Alice was saying earlier that I think is super important. And this is going to be, I think, a running motif throughout the day. Because sometimes when you have a theme, I mean, even like Citizen Artists, but specifically service, it can sound like, do good, you know, be nice, be altruistic, right? This is good, you know, and it deserves a pat on the head because it's so nice, right? And there's a different story to tell here, though. It's embodied in the work that each of you does, and it is a story of do this because it is in our mutual self-interest.
That's right.
Do this because if you don't do this, you're going to die.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
If you live in a fast food culture, if you fail to see black space as our space, if you kind of compartmentalize your sense of visual memory and identity in ways that don't include people who don't look or sound or speak like you, and if you don't embrace weirdness as a portal for everybody to actually engage in civic life, we're going to die, right? And so that larger story is not just that this is nice stuff, but that it is necessary stuff.
Well, it's imperative. I think of it as an imperative. And there's just one thing that I want to say. I know that we have to wrap up soon. I am deeply aware that the sort of landscape that we're in right now, through this sort of incredible shift that's taking place within the country, we know that the country will be a majority-minority state very, 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 very soon. A part of the conversation that we're having, a part of this conversation about citizens and artistry and social engagement is coming out of that, and it's being spurred by that. I'm also looking at the way in which, you know, corporations are usurping the idea of social engagement and civic dialogue for their own purposes as this comes to a head. But the other thing that I want to say, and the thing that I think I often find missing, is that we fail to come together consistently consistently as a group to do this kind of critical thinking. One of the things that's been shown, and people like David Flashman, I think, has been doing very, very interesting research. That when people come together and they talk directly, in direct communication about complicated social issues, you are usually able to change that person's mind from a 0, like I'm not interested in gay people, to maybe even a 10 where, yes, I'll actually vote for a law for gay marriage, right? Within the course of 20 minutes, that conversation, that change can happen. But the thing that was very interesting about his research is this, that unless you actually have sustained conversation over a period of time, then the person who was willing to change their position, their traditional position, goes back to that position within about 3 to 6 months. Which means that unless you are engaged constantly in this sort of deep and abiding work, then you actually lose.
Well, this is perhaps as great a segue to my job of tying things up here a little bit here as we segue to the next segment of the program. And one thing that I would just note about this conversation, actually one thing, just in the spirit which I know we will embody later in the day of making commitments and turning ideas into action. This corporation that Carrie May just formed here.
My new team.
We at Citizen University pledge to be a container for that corporation in this endeavor. If you four are serious about wanting to play together, we will make a playground for it. So that's number one. But number two, I think one of the things that is so powerful about some of the metaphors we've heard in this short conversation about the draw, about the Montessori spirit of providing some works and forms, but then being guided by where the learners are going and what they're doing with them. The spirit of just the pirate store, you kind of accidentally bump into learning the skills that you need in order to navigate your way to your initial aim. What we're talking about here are the skills of citizenship. This ability to take accident and random circumstance and convert it, even though it looks nothing like your plan, into collective endeavor, is citizenship. This work of being able and willing to imagine mutuality and collective self-interest is citizenship. And the ability of all these folks to do that conversion from the I see to the I do is citizenship as well. And I just am so grateful that the spirit of service was planted early in your lives, in your minds, in your victory gardens, and in your families, so that you can now spread it with all of us and the rest of the world. Please join me in thanking the Spirit Panel.
Wonderful. So glad to